The long winter begins. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to step quietly into a frontier winter, not as a traveller passing through, but as a townsman, a farmer, or a homesteader who must endure every day until the thaw? Dim the lights if they are too sharp. Adjust your pillow if it feels uneven. Let your breathing fall gently into its own rhythm. This story will not hurry. It will drift as slowly as snow upon a fence rail. If you close your eyes before the chapter ends, the tale will continue without you, and that is quite all right. The breath of frost. You step outside at dawn. The smell of wood smoke clings to the air, rising from every cabin chimney like thin grey ribbons. Frost crunches beneath your boots, and the sound seems louder in the silence. The river has grown sluggish, its edges rimmed with ice that catches the first light of morning. You draw your coat tighter, and your fingers brush against rough wool, stiff with yesterday's dampness. The cold does not announce itself with urgency. It simply seeps, patiently, into everything. Historians still debate whether frontier winters were harsher in memory than in reality. Some records suggest that settlers exaggerated storms in journals to make their endurance seem nobler. Others note that temperatures, though severe, were often managed with careful preparation. The truth, as always, rests somewhere between myth and routine. The wood floor creaks as you walk, the boards expanding and shrinking with the shifting weather. You glance toward the hearth, where last night's embers glow faintly. You lift the iron poker, stir the ashes, and coax a flame back to life. The warmth is gentle, not yet strong, but it is enough to ease your breath. Step by step, the morning begins. Place small twigs carefully on the red embers. Listen to the crackle as they take the flame. Lay larger sticks, one at a time, until the fire steadies. Because nothing says welcome to winter quite like smoke stinging your eyes while you try to boil water. He has a habit of arriving at your door to borrow what he misplaced. Last year it was his axe, mislaid in a snowbank, until spring. The year before, a kettle left near the creek. Today, he leans on your doorframe with his usual sheepish grin. "Forgot my tinderbox again," he mumbles, shaking his head as though the item itself had chosen to hide. You hand him a bundle of dry shavings without complaint. It is easier to share than to scold. In truth, these small exchanges stitch the fabric of survival. No family, no matter how determined, endured a frontier winter entirely alone. The whisper of Martha. Later in the day, you hear the low voice of Martha the whisperer. She speaks in hushed tones even when there is no need. Some say she learned to talk that way while rocking her children to sleep. She offers quiet advice about sealing the cabin walls. She suggests stuffing moss into the gaps where wind seeps through. You nod, though you have already done the same. Her whispers carry a sense of calm, as though she were sharing secrets with the walls themselves. The myth of abundance. Many imagine that settlers faced winter with full larders, barrels of salted meat, shelves of preserves, stacks of corn. The myth is of abundance. The reality is measured. You glance at the sacks of grain. They are not overflowing. They are simply enough. If you are careful, step by step you take stock. Count the sacks of dried beans. Lift the lids of pickle jars, checking the brine. Test the salted pork, pressing against the rind to see if it has kept well. Note how many candles remain, stubs included, because nothing says security quite like realizing your candle supply could be measured in hours instead of days. A gentle dilemma. As the light fades, you consider whether to burn more wood tonight, or conserve the pile for colder weeks ahead. It is not a dramatic choice. It is a quiet, constant balancing act. Comfort now, or caution later. The logs stacked neatly by the door remind you of every evening yet to come. Evening sounds. The day closes with soft sounds. The creak of rafters as the cold presses down. The distant howl of wind across the open field. The muted laughter of children playing with frozen breath, drifting through the dark. Inside, the air carries the faint smell of damp wool drying near the hearth. You run your hand along the quilt, coarse, heavy, but dependable. Shadows stretch across the floor, and the flame waves. Soft landing. The fire crackles softly as the wind sighs against the shutters. Your breath slows, matching the rhythm of the flame. The long winter has only begun, but already you feel its steady, unhurried embrace. And as the night deepens, you drift gently into rest, carried forward by the slow cadence of snow. Cabins and insulation. The draft creeps in. You notice it first as a thread of cold air along the floor. It snakes quietly across your ankles, reminding you that walls of logs are not seamless shields. The smell of damp moss lingers faintly where you pressed it between the beams. A soft groan comes from the cabin frame as the wind leans into it. Many imagine that frontier cabins were warm havens against the storms. Historians remind us otherwise. Letters from the 1830s describe wind rattling through cracks wide enough to slip a finger. Even when families prepared carefully, the cold found its way inside. Myth promises coziness. Reality offers drafts, step by step sealing the walls. You bend low, pressing fresh moss into gaps where the last filling has shrunk. Your fingers brush against the rough, cool surface of the logs. The process is unhurried, almost ritual. Gather moss, dry and pliable, from the wood. Roll it gently, squeezing out moisture. Press it into the chinks between logs, packing it firmly. Smooth mud or clay over the moss, sealing it in place. Pat the surface, listening to the faint thud as it's, because nothing says comfort quite like spending an afternoon stuffing your house with mud. Neighbor Amos returns. The sound of boots crunching again outside. Amos the forgetful appears at your door, hat askew, cheeks red from the cold. This time he has not misplaced an axe or a kettle. Instead he holds a plank of wood. Meant to patch my wall, he says, but the hammer's gone missing. You lend him yours. Later you will find his hammer resting in plain sight on his own bench. Such things are expected. His forgetfulness is as steady as the winter itself. The quilt over the door. Inside, Martha the whisperer murmurs, as she drapes a quilt across the doorframe. Keeps the wind out, she explains in her soft tone. Though you already know, the quilt is patched many times over. Bits of old shirts, faded skirts, worn apron. It hangs heavy, brushing the floor each time you pass through. The fabric smells faintly of lye soap and old smoke. The quilt does not stop all drafts, but it slows them, and that is enough. Myth. The reality, cabin warmth. The myth imagines rosy-cheeked families by blazing fires, walls snug as brick. Reality notes that smoke often filled the room, and heat pooled only near the hearth. Children sometimes slept with their feet toward the embers, wrapped in heavy quilt. The far side of the room remained cold, and frost could gather on the inside of walls. Some records describe cups of water freezing overnight on tables, just a few feet from the fire. A strange coexistence, warmth and ice, both inside the same small room. Step by step, hanging hides. When quilts ran short, families sometimes stretched animal hides across windows or doors. The process is slow but steady. Scrape the hide clean and let it dry. Rub it with fat to keep it pliable. Stretch it over the opening, nailing it to the frame. Smooth the edges to keep the wind from lifting it. The hide lets in little light, but it keeps the air from whistling through, because nothing says frontier decor quite like deer skin for curtain. A gentle dilemma. You stand with one last quilt folded in your arms. Amos's cabin, you know, leaks worse than yours. Martha whispers that his children cough at night. Do you lend him the quilt, risking your own comfort? Or do you keep it for your family? It is not a grand decision. It is one of many small balances that shape the winter. Evening sounds and smells. Night descends. The air inside smells faintly of wet earth where the clay seal still dries. A log pops in the hearth, echoing like a muffled knock. Shadows slide along the walls, broken by beams of moonlight squeezing through narrow gaps. You run your hand along the rough edge of the quilt, its seams ridged beneath your palm. The cabin holds, imperfect, drafty, patched, but it holds. Soft landing, the fire hums quietly, the moss settles into the cracks, and the quilt sways gently with each whisper of wind. Your breath deepens, as the walls creak and sigh, and you drift slowly into rest. The winter diet, the pantry quiet. You step into the small pantry where the smell of earth and salt greets you. Barrels stand in the dimness, their lids rough with scratches from many uses. A faint drip of melted frost slides down one wall, landing with a quiet tap against the floorboard. The air feels cooler here, the kind of chill that keeps food just barely safe from spoilage. The myth says frontier families ate heartily through the winter, feasts of meat and bread every night. The reality, confirmed by journals and household inventories, was plain meals repeated, day after day. Beans, cornmeal, salt pork. Some families spoke of monotony as though it were another form of weather, constant, shaping mood, impossible to escape. Step by step, preparing hominy. Today you begin with corn, ground into coarse meal. The process is patient. Soak the corn overnight until it softens. Rub it between your hands, the husks falling away. Boil it slowly, stirring with a wooden spoon until it thickens. Add a pinch of salt if you can spare it. Serve it plain, steaming, filling but not exciting. Because nothing says frontier cuisine quite like corn prepared in 5 slightly different ways. The scent of salted pork. You lift the lid of a barrel and the smell of salt strikes immediately, sharp, briny, preserving. Inside, slabs of pork lie packed in crystals, pale and you pry one free, fingers gritty with salt. The meat is rinsed, boiled, then fried in a pan until it sputters. The sound is almost cheerful, a rare liveliness in the quiet room. Neighbor Amos once swore he dreamed of pork so often he could taste it even without eating. Martha the whisperer told him it was a sign to chew more slowly. Her solutions always sound simple, even when they are not. Bread hard as iron. On the shelf rests a loaf of bread baked days ago. The crust is so firm it might resist a nut. You press your palm against it, and the hardness makes you laugh softly, because nothing says nourishment quite like bread that could double as a hammer. Yet even this is valuable. Dipped in broth it softens, broken into crumbs, it thickens. Its sturdiness is not a flaw, it is endurance in edible form. A gentle dilemma. You sit by the fire with a bowl of beans. The portion is smaller than you would like. Do you eat it now, filling your stomach but leaving less for tomorrow? Or do you set some aside, letting hunger linger tonight? It is not desperation, it is quiet arithmetic. Each spoonful is both present comfort and future caution. Reality. Winter abundance. Some travelers' tales claim settlers enjoyed smoked venison, wild turkeys, endless preserves. Historians note that hunting often failed in deep snow, and game moved elsewhere. Root cellars held potatoes and turnips, but not without sprouting or softening. The reality was measured scarcity. The myth was memory seasoned with imagination. Letters from the 1840s describe children cheering for molasses on bread as though it were a grand feat. What seemed humble then becomes vivid now, a reminder that sweetness was rare, but all the more treasured for it. Step by step stretching a stew. To make the food last, you prepare stew carefully. Begin with a small piece of pork, barely enough for flavor. Add beans or peas, soaked overnight. Slice in onions, their sharpness softened by cooking. Stir slowly, letting the broth thicken. Break hard bread into the pot, swelling into substance. The aroma spreads, filling the cabin with warmth that seems larger than the meal itself. Because nothing says family supper quite like disguising scarcity as abundance. Children at the table. Little Tom, the boy with the wooden whistle, sits cross-legged, waiting for his share. He runs his finger along the rim of the bowl, impatient but silent. Martha whispers to him about chewing slowly, as though savoring stretches food farther. He nods, though the whistle soon returns to his lips after the meal, a soft tune mingling with the scent of stew. The room smells of beans and smoke, lingering long after the dishes are set aside. You run your hand across the table, feeling the grain of wood polished smooth by years of use. Outside, snow drifts against the walls, muffling sound. The stew simmers in memory, even after the pot is empty, and you drift with the rhythm of the spoon, steady and slow, lighting the darkness. The long night arrives. The sun slips behind the trees early, leaving the cabin in shadow. You notice how the air grows still as the last rays fade. The smell of smoke lingers faintly from the hearth, and the sound of your own breath seems louder in the dark. You touch the wooden table, its surface cool, waiting for the small glow of a candle. The myth remembers frontier cabins bathed in golden light, windows glowing warmly across snowy fields. The reality is dimmer. Candles were precious, oil was scarce, families often sat close together, gathered around a single flame. Darkness was not something defeated, it was something endured. Step by step, making tallow candles, you set about the familiar task. The steps unfold with unhurried patience. Melt the tallow slowly in an iron pot. Cut a length of cotton for the wick. Dip the wick once, then let it cool. Dip again, building the candle layer by layer. Hang it on a wooden rack, where it hardens, with a faint smell of animal fat. Because nothing says evening luxury quite like hours of work for a candle that burns unevenly. The smell is sharp, lingering, filling the room even before the candle is lit. Some families joked that the candle consumed more appetite than it saved. Oil lamps and pine knots. When tallow was scarce, families turned to oil lamps. Small, simple, often smoky. Whale oil, if one could obtain it, burned brightly but was costly. More often settlers used animal fat, or improvised pine knots. A pine knot, lit at one end, hissed with resin, crackling as it gave light. The smoke filled the cabin, stinging eyes, coating rafters with soot.
because nothing says gentle romance quite like choking on pine smoke while reading aloud. Neighbor Amos visits again. Amos the forgetful arrives once more, cradling a broken lantern. He mumbles that the glass cracked when he tried to warm it too close to the fire. Light goes everywhere but where I need it, he said. You hand him a spare stub of candle, knowing it will not last long. Amos smiles with gratitude anyway, promising to return the lantern fixed, though you suspect it may reappear unchecked. Martha the whisperer at the firelight. Later, Martha sits near the hearth, her voice barely rising above the hiss of the flame. She tells you how her grandmother read Bible verses by lamplight so faint it could scarcely reach
The morning chill and dressing ritual. You wake again the next morning, and the air feels sharper, as if the night pressed cold into every crack of the cabin. You hear the faint creak of rafters settling under snow, and before you even rise, you know what must come next. The slow ritual of dressing. The garments are stiff with frost where they hung overnight. You reach for your shirt, and the linen feels almost like paper, frozen flat in places. As you pull it over your arms, the fabric softens against your skin. Next, the wool trousers slide on, heavy and itching at the thighs. Then comes the patched coat, still smelling faintly of smoke. Historians note that some families slept in layers of clothing, unwilling to undress at all during the worst of the cold. One settler's diary from 1838 remarks, "We changed but once in the long season, for it was warmer to wear filth than to risk frost." The line is written without shame, only practicality, because nothing says dignity quite like realizing you will smell like smoke and wool for 6 months straight. The sound of needles. By the hearth, Martha's needle moves steadily. The sound is soft but distinct, a small snap as it pierces cloth, a faint sigh as thread pulls through. She whispers instructions to little Tom, who tries clumsily to sew a scrap. His stitches tangle, a knot forming midway. Martha smiles faintly, never raising her voice. Every family relied on sewing as much as on firewood. Without constant repair, clothing simply fell apart. Some records describe entire evenings devoted to patching, not as a chore but as the season's expected rhythm. You imagine a row of cabins across the valley, each lit by one candle, each filled with the same sound of thread sliding through cloth. The myth of fur-lined luxury. Stories from travelers often spoke of coats lined with beaver, collars trimmed with fox, mittens edged with ermine. The reality, such garments were rare and costly. Most families made do with wool, patched hides, and simple cloth wrapping. Fur was prized but often sold for trade rather than worn. A pelt could buy salt, flour, or tools, necessities that outweighed comfort. Even when fur was kept, it carried its own challenges. Wet fur froze stiff, crackling when bent, and the smell of damp animal lingered long after drying. The luxury, in truth, was another form of labor. Step by step, quilting together warmth. Martha shows how to quilt from scraps. Gather pieces of worn-out clothing, shirts, trousers, skirts too thin for wear. Cut them into squares, the edges uneven, but serviceable. Stitch each piece to another, forming a patchwork larger with every hour. Layer the patchwork over old wool, making a sandwich of fabric. Sew across the layers, thread crisscrossing like lines on a map. The result is heavy, awkward, but warm. A quilt that looks less like art and more like endurance. Because nothing says frontier chic quite like sleeping beneath your family's laundry. Sewn into a single blanket. Amos and the missing buttons. Later, Amos visits again, fumbling with his coat. 2 buttons are gone, and the front flap's loose in the wind. Can't seem to hold it closed, he mutters, pulling the sides together with one hand. Martha sighs, whispers, and begins to sew replacements. She finds 1 wooden button, 1 brass, and 1 carved from bone. By the end, Amos wears a coat that looks like 3 garments stitched together. He beams, proud of the repair, and promises once again to keep better care this time. You exchange a glance with Martha, both knowing the promise will not last the season. The smell of storage. In the corner stands a chest of clothing reserved for emergencies. The air changes as you lift the lid, a smell of mildew, cedar and mothballs, made from dried herbs. The garments inside are older, worn but still whole. Each piece carries memory. A dress worn at a wedding, a coat inherited from a father, a scarf knitted by a hand long gone. Historians note that garments often stayed in families for decades, repurposed again and again. A wool blanket might be cut into coats, a worn coat turned into mittens. Each fabric lived multiple lives before vanishing. Clothing was not fashion, it was genealogy stitched in thread. A gentle dilemma. You hold 2 garments, a thin coat with history, its fabric weak but lined with memory, and a thicker coat, newly bartered, sturdy but without sentiment. Which to wear, which to pass to the children? Warmth against nostalgia, utility against remembrance. The choice lingers, as many do, without resolution. The cabin smells of wool warmed by fire, mingled with smoke and faint grease from boots drying nearby. The sound of the wind presses against the shutters, and inside the rustle of cloth is constant. Sleeves brushed, quilts adjusted, mittens tugged tight. Little Tom curls in his patchwork coat, blowing one last faint note on his wooden whistle, before sleep. Amos snores lightly, his mismatched buttons glinting in the firelight. Martha whispers a prayer as she folds her needlework away. The seams creak, the cloaks weigh heavy, and your breath rises steady into the dim room. The fire flickers, the cloth settles against your skin, and the cabin sighs into stillness, layers upon layers, not only of fabric but of memory, patience, and quiet endurance. You exhale slowly, wrapped in wool and silence, and drift into rest. The still morning, you wake to the muffled sound of laughter outside, faint and thin against the weight of snow. The air in the cabin is sharp with frost, and your breath clouds pale in front of you. The children have risen earlier than you, their small boots already tracking white powder across the floorboards. The myth often paints frontier childhoods as a sequence of sleigh rides and snowball fights, cheerful days of play untroubled by hardship. The reality is gentler, quieter, and far more burdened with duty. Childhood here does not pause for the season. The children rise as you do, to chores before play, to responsibility before game. Step by step the morning chores. Little Tom, still clutching his wooden whistle even in sleep, is coaxed into work by Martha's whispers. The chores unfold like a ritual. Fetch water from the half-frozen barrel outside, the rope stiff with ice. Carry kindling into the cabin, arms trembling with the load. Feed the chickens, scattering cracked corn while their breath steams in the cold. Sweep snow from the threshold, the broom bristles stiff and squeaking. Only then, slip into the rare moment of play, if strength allows, because nothing says childhood quite like beginning the day with chores that weigh heavier than your own small frame. The myth of idleness. Travelers sometimes described frontier children as idle, wandering fields, or playing in drifts. Historians point to journals that tell otherwise. Children as young as 5 were set to tasks, spinning wool, gathering eggs, carrying firewood. A letter from 1842 records a boy whose hands cracked like his father's, though he was but 7 years of age. Childhood was not a season apart, but simply a smaller share of the family labor. Play in the snow. Still there is laughter. You watch as Tom and his sister stamp paths into the snow, carving trails from door to barn, from fence to well. The snow squeaks under their boots, the sound oddly cheerful in the stillness. They shape figures, arms outstretched, bodies spread against the white, leaving angel shapes behind. Their cheeks burn red, their noses drip, but the giggles cut through the silence of winter. Amos, arriving late as always, watches the children play and mutters, "Best not waste the strength." Yet even he cannot hide a smile when Tom blows a note on his whistle, high and shrill against the still morning air. The smell of wax and wood. Inside, the children settle to quieter tasks. One girl polishes wooden spoons with beeswax, the smell sweet and faintly honeyed, filling the cabin with a softer note. Another mends a doll's dress with scraps of cloth, the thread bright against faded fabric. Tom, restless, drums his whistle against the table until Martha whispers for stillness. The room carries many scents: smoke, damp wool, faint honey, earth from boots. Each one tells the season in its own way, layering memory with sensation. Step by step carving a toy. On longer nights, fathers often carved toys from wood. The process is unhurried. Select a piece of soft pine, the grain straight and clean. Cut away bark, the shavings falling in curls that smell sharp and resinous. Shape the block into a horse, a whistle, or a simple figure, smooth with a scrap of sand though rough edges remain. Hand it to waiting children, who see magic where you see only wood, because nothing says luxury quite like a horse that looks suspiciously like a potato, but neighs convincingly in the imagination. The myth of schooling. It is easy to believe children spent long winters in lessons, neatly copying lines into slates by the fire. The reality was far less regular. Some winters brought no school at all if the teacher was snowed in, or if families needed labor at home. Learning was often oral, Bible verses repeated, arithmetic practiced in whispers, letters scratched into frost on windows. Historians note that literacy varied widely. Some children read scripture fluently by 10, while others knew only a few letters. Education was shaped by weather, distance, and necessity more than desire. The sounds of winter games. When chores allow, children invent play from what they have. Stones rattled in a tin serve as dice. A length of rope becomes a whip for a make-believe wagon. The sound of boots crunching in snow becomes a rhythm for chanting rhymes. Tom's whistle joins, shrill and insistent,
echoing against the cabin walls until Martha shushes him again with her soft hand. Laughter is not constant, but when it comes it spreads quickly, louder than the fire, louder even than the wind pressing at the shutters. A gentle dilemma. You hold a small piece of preserved fruit, rare and sweet. Do you share it among the children, letting each taste only a sliver, or save it for a moment of greater need? It is not a grand question, but it lingers. Sweetness is not simply flavor, it is memory, encouragement, a small light in a season of sameness. Evening quiet. As night falls, the children gather near the fire. The smell of drying wool fills the room, and the sound of whispering stories carries softly. One child nods, eyelids heavy, before chores are finished. Another curls on the floor wrapped in quilts, the patched fabric scratching against skin. Tom clutches his whistle, silent now, his breath slow and even. The cabin sighs, the fire hums low. Children breathe steadily in sleep, their boots drying by the hearth, their mittens stiff with frost. You sit quietly, wrapped in the rhythm of their small lives, their chores, their laughter. The whistle rests silent, and you drift gently into stillness. The frost on little hands. In the early morning, you notice how the children's hands redden as they haul wood inside. The skin cracks near the knuckles, small lines that sting when rubbed. They flex their fingers by the fire, wincing as warmth returns. A faint smell of resin clings to the wood they carry, mixing with smoke in the air. Historians remind us that chilblains, swollen, itchy sores from cold exposure, were nearly universal among frontier children. Diaries mention fingers burning worse inside than out, as warmth brought blood rushing back. The discomfort was accepted, endured without drama. Children were expected to keep moving, because stillness made the pain sharper. Step by step hauling water in winter. When the family needs water, it is the children who fetch it. The task unfolds. Lift the bucket from its peg, the handle icy against small fingers. Step outside, boots sinking into snow that squeaks at each step. Break the crust of ice on the barrel or stream, the sound sharp as glass. Dip the bucket, the cold biting wrists as water splashes. Return slowly, careful not to spill, arms straining with the weight. Because nothing says childhood quite like carrying more than your own weight in freezing water before breakfast. The myth of winter playthings. Illustrations sometimes show frontier children, with dolls in fine clothes, sleds polished smooth, or painted toys from The reality leaned toward improvisation. Dolls were rags bound together, faces drawn with charcoal. Sleds were boards nailed crudely to runners. Toys often came not from stores but from idle whittling on long nights. The joy was not diminished, only reshaped. One letter from 1852 describes a girl treasuring a corn husk doll so much that she kept it beside her bed all winter, lest it grow lonely. Such tenderness gives weight to the simplest of objects. The sound of indoor games. Snowed in for days, the children invent games around the hearth. Pebbles dropped into a tin serve as counting markers. A hoop rolled across the floor is chased until it tips and wobbles. Tom's whistle reappears, each note squealing above the crackle of the fire, until Amos, visiting again, groans and presses his hands to his ears. Lad, that sound could crack the ice on the pond, Amos mutters, though his eyes soften with amusement. Martha only whispers, one more note, then rest. And so it goes, balance between noise and quiet. Step by step sewing for small hands. Children too are put to work with needle and thread. The method is slower, clumsier, but still important. Thread the needle with yarn, knotting it firmly. Push it through the cloth, the stitch uneven and wandering. Tug too hard, and the fabric puckers. Try again, whispering, as Martha encourages, steady as the flame. Patch finished, the garment returns to use, however lopsided. Because nothing says growing up quite like learning that your first 5 stitches look like tangled fishing line. The myth of endless lessons. It is tempting to picture long evenings of schooling, children bent over slates, lessons filling the dark. The truth was uneven. Some families read scripture nightly, children repeating verses aloud until words. Others focused on arithmetic, tallying sums needed for trade. Still others abandoned lessons in hard winters, preferring warmth and work over study. Historians still debate how much literacy shaped survival. Some argue it was less vital than strength and skill. Yet records also show families proud when a child could sign their own name in a ledger, a mark of presence in a world that often overlooked them. A gentle dilemma. You sit with a small candle stub, the flame wavering. Should it be used for children's lessons, reading aloud, practicing letters, or saved for mending clothes by night? Light is always measured, rationed like food. To burn it now is to risk darkness later. The children's eyes watch the flame. You decide quietly, though either choice feels half right. The cold of the barn. Children's work does not end indoors. You follow them to the barn, the smell of hay and animals pressing warm against the cold air. Their breath rises in quick clouds as they scatter straw, milk cows with clumsy hands, and break ice on troughs. The barn is noisy, hooves thudding, chains clinking, animals snorting. Yet beneath the noise you hear children humming, their voices high and light, steadying themselves against the chill. Tom places his whistle to his lips, only to find it too cold to play. He tucks it back into his coat, cheeks red with disappointment. Even whistles, it seems, must rest in the winter. Evening stories. At night the children gather close, listening as Amos recounts half-remembered tales of his own boyhood. He speaks of winters when snow reached the roof, of sleds that ran so far they seemed to chase the moon. Martha interrupts gently, whispering, "Exaggerations, Amos." But the children listen wide-eyed anyway. Myth mixes with memory here, teaching as much as entertaining. Some stories soothe, others warn, all shaping how the young see their world. The chores complete, the stories finished, the whistle tucked away. The children breathe steadily in their quilts, the sound of sleep gentle as falling snow. The cabin hums with warmth not only from the fire but from their presence, small lives bright against the long dark. You exhale, the silence settling, and drift into the same quiet rhythm. Neighbors and shared survival. The snowbound path. You open the door, and the path between your cabin and Amos's has nearly vanished. Snow drifts pile high, reshaped by the night's wind. The cold nips at your cheeks as you step out, each foot sinking deep with a crunch. The smell of smoke carries faintly from Martha's chimney down the slope, a reminder that even in this stillness, others endure the same season. The myth of frontier life often tells of families in complete isolation, cabins scattered so far apart that neighbors vanished for months at a time. The reality was more complicated. While travel was difficult, families found ways to cross snowy fields, to knock on doors, to share what could not be spared but could not be withheld either. Step by step clearing the path. Before you can visit, the path must be shaped. The work is slow but steady. Take the shovel from its peg, the handle icy to your touch. Step forward, sinking into snow until your knees ache. Push the blade down, the sound sharp as it cuts through crust. Toss the snow aside where it lands in soft heaps against the fence. Repeat until a narrow way stretches between cabins, a thread of connection carved into white silence. Because nothing says community quite like shoveling for half an hour, only to realize you've cleared just 10 steps. Amos at the door. When you finally reach Amos's cabin, he greets you with his usual sheepish grin. His hat is missing again, his hair a nest of frost. Misplaced it somewhere, he says, though you both know the search will likely take days. He ushers you in, the door creaking as he pulls it shut. Inside, the air smells of smoke, onions and damp wool. He shows you the latest trouble, his axe misplaced once more. He shrugs. "Borrowed yours last week, didn't I? Might still be leaning against your wall." You nod, half amused, half resigned. Amos's forgetfulness is a constant, a rhythm of winter life. The whisper of Martha. Later you step into Martha's cabin, where the air is quieter. She speaks softly, as always, her whispers threading through the room like smoke. She offers tea brewed from dried herbs, its faint scent earthy and sharp. She asks how your firewood holds out, whether your roof still leaks. Her questions are not idle, they are the unspoken language of survival. To ask is to show care, to answer honestly is to admit need. The myth of solitude. Stories written later often claim that settlers endured winters entirely alone, stoic and independent, yet journals reveal visits, exchanges and shared labor. One account from 1845 notes neighbors pooling food for a family struck by illness. Another describes a man, lending his only saw, trusting it would return in spring. Solitude was an exaggeration, dependence was the quiet truth. Step by step, lending and borrowing. The rhythm of exchange is simple, repeated across winters. Knock softly at the door, snow falling from your shoulders. Ask in gentle words, never too blunt, might you have a spare? Accept what is offered, whether a tool, a candle, or a handful of salt. Promise its return, even if spring feels far away. Leave behind something small if you can, even only a word of thanks. Because nothing says good manners quite like trading your last candle stub for half a loaf of bread. A gentle dilemma. You hold a sack of beans, small but precious. A neighbor knocks, whispering of hunger. Do you share, stretching little into less, or do you keep silent, guarding your family's portion? It is not an easy choice, nor an urgent one, just a slow question that lingers with every knock. The snow falls steady, the paths narrow, the doors creak open and close. Neighbors visit, forgetful Amos fumbling, Martha whispering care, children trailing with red cheeks. The fire glows in each cabin, and the silence between homes hums with connection. You breathe slowly, the air heavy with smoke and frost, and drift into the rhythm of shared survival. The visit across snow. The path to Martha's home takes you past fences nearly buried. The snow glitters faintly in morning light, and the only sound is the crunch of boots, pressing new trails. A crow calls once, harsh and lonely, its voice carrying over the silent field. You draw your scarf tighter, feeling the coarse wool scratch your neck. When you reach her door, she greets you with her usual whisper. Her voice is as soft as the steam rising from the kettle she sets on the stove. The smell of dried mint fills the air, sharp and clean, curling into the room with warmth. She offers you a cup, and for a moment the winter seems smaller, easier to hold. The myth of self-reliance. Much has been written about frontier self-reliance, the image of families carving survival alone from the wilderness. But letters and journals remind us of something quieter. Self-reliance was always woven with reliance on others. A woman in Wisconsin wrote in 1857, "Without neighbors, one perishes. Alone the food spoils, the roof caves, and the spirits falter." The myth comforts, but the reality is gentler. Survival shaped by hands reaching toward one another. Step by step, the winter visit. The practice of visiting follows its own routine, familiar as any chore. Rise early, dress in layers of woolen hides, wrap a bundle, perhaps a loaf of bread, a twist of dried herbs, or a candle stuck. Step into the snow, boots squeaking, scarf dampening with frost. Knock softly at the neighbor's door, a sound half swallowed by the storm. Sit near their fire, share your news and trade what you can spare. Because nothing says friendship quite like walking a mile through snow to exchange 3 onions for 1 candle. Amos and the misplaced saw. Amos appears one afternoon carrying half a plank. He explains, sheepish as ever, that his saw is missing. Again might have left it in the shed, or the barn, or somewhere near the creek. You lend him yours, knowing it will take weeks to return. Later you hear that he used the saw to cut wood for his stove, then misplaced it behind a pile of logs. The pattern is familiar, and yet you do not begrudge him. Forgetfulness is his contribution, as steady as your patience. The sounds of neighbors gathering. On some evenings, when snow eases and paths are passable, neighbors gather in one cabin. The sounds are many, boots stamping snow at the threshold, mittens shaken free of frost, chairs creaking as they are drawn near the fire. Children giggle, their voices high against the deep murmur of adults. The air smells of wool drying and stew thickening, scents mingling into a comfort larger than any one family's hearth. Martha whispers stories of her grandmother, Amos mutters about tools gone astray, and you sit quietly, warmed as much by their company as by the fire. The myth of isolation. Historians often note how the image of isolation exaggerates the hardship of winter. Cabins might be separated by miles, yet those miles were crossed, slowly but steadily. Families wrote of trudging through snow to share news, to lend tools, to sit by another fire for a single evening. One settler's diary records, "It was worth the frost on my face to hear another voice." Isolation was real, but so was connection, woven like paths through snowdrift. Step by step, rules of winter etiquette. Neighbors carried unspoken codes, rules shaped by necessity and kindness. They might be written this way: never arrive empty-handed, even if only with a story. Always knock softly, storms echo loud enough without fists. Do not linger too long, firewood burns for the host as well. Share news freely, for voices are warmth when food is scarce. If borrowing, promise return, though spring may test your memory. Leave with thanks, spoken simply, not insisted upon, because nothing says civility quite like apologizing while carrying home your neighbor's kettle. A gentle dilemma. One evening Martha asks in her whisper whether you might spare a little lamp oil. You glance at your own jug, the level low, the flame uncertain. Do you share, dimming your own nights, or decline, knowing her cabin will sit in shadows? It is not a loud question, but it lingers as quietly as the flame itself. Evening silence. When the visits end, the snow covers the paths again. Doors shut, fires burn lower, and silence spreads across the valley. Yet even then, the presence of neighbors lingers. You know Amos is fumbling with his saw, Martha is whispering into the night, and children are dozing under quilts, alone yet not alone. The snow presses against doors, the fire flickers, and the night deepens. Neighbors' voices echo faintly in memory, softening the dark. You exhale slowly, wrapped not only in wool but in the quiet comfort of knowing others are near. Faith, superstition and stories by the long night within. The fire flickers low, and shadows gather in the corners of the cabin. The sound of the wind fades into a hush, leaving the room quiet, except for the slow crackle of the log. It is evening, and with work done, the family turns to the oldest comforts, faith, superstition, and the telling of stories. The myth imagines frontier families kneeling nightly in solemn prayer, piety unbroken, voices rising in perfect unity. The reality, however, was faith was steady, yes, but threaded with doubt, superstition and humor. Some turned to scripture, others to charms, and many to whispered tales that blurred belief and imagination. Step by step, reading by firelight, a Bible rests on the table, its cover worn, pages stiff from smoke and damp. The act of reading becomes a ritual. Trim the candle wick, steadying the flame, place the book carefully, pages weighted with a stone. Read slowly, words echoing in the dim room. Children repeat the lines, half from memory, half from sound. Close the book gently, wax dripping onto the table, because nothing says devotion quite like squinting through smoke to find the verse you already know by heart. Martha's whispered beliefs. Martha leans close to the fire, her voice lower than ever. She speaks of opening a window when sickness enters, to let the spirit escape. She tells of herbs tied above the door to ward off bad luck. Not scripture, she admits softly, but wisdom handed down. Her whisper is neither defiant nor ashamed. It is simply another thread in the weave of winter. The myth of pure reason. Later accounts sometimes claim settlers were guided only by practical reason, but records tell otherwise. Farmers hung horseshoes above doors, children carried charms, and families whispered against witches when cows went dry. In one 1832 journal, a woman confessed that she placed a broom across the doorway at night, so no spirit might enter. Faith was strong but superstition lingered, shaping small choices each day. The candle of stubborn prayers. Amos, visiting one evening, lights a candle that smokes endlessly, the flame guttering. He mutters that it smells like stubborn prayers, loud, but not quite answered. The children laugh. Martha scolds gently in a whisper, and the candle burns on, leaving soot along the beam, because nothing says frontier theology quite like a candle that insists on smoking no matter how you trim the wick. Step by step, storytelling rituals. When the Bible closes, another ritual begins, the telling of stories. The process is slow and predictable, like the fire itself. One person begins, often with a phrase known to all. Others listen quietly, the crackle of fire marking pause. Children lean closer, eyes wide though heavy with sleep. A second voice adds, correcting or embellishing. The story ends, not with applause but with silence, as though it were always meant to fade that way. Because nothing says entertainment quite like retelling the same tale, for the 12th winter in a row. A gentle dilemma. You hold a pouch of dried herbs, sage for cooking, or for burning in the doorway to keep away misfortune. Do you use it for food, easing hunger, or scatter it for protection, easing fear? The choice is quiet, not urgent, but it lingers each time the pouch is open. The candle flickers, the Bible rests closed, and Martha's whispers drift into the air. Amos mutters at the smoke. Tom yawns with his whistle clutched in hand. Shadows stretch along the beams, and the fire hums lower. You exhale slowly, the quiet filled with stories and superstition, and drift into the long night. Faith, superstition, and story.
The hymns in the cabin. The children settle cross-legged on the floor as you begin a hymn. The sound is low, slow, shaped less by melody than by rhythm. The fire hums behind the voices, each note softened by smoke. Martha whispers the verses, barely audible, while Tom blows a faint tone from his wooden whistle, convinced he is contributing to the choir. The myth imagines hymns echoing grandly in churches with tall windows and polished pews. The reality is simpler. Voices rising in a cramped cabin, smoke curling overhead, boots stacked by the door. Faith is not diminished by its size. It is only reshaped, step by step, keeping a Sabbath indoors. The snow blocks paths. The wind makes travel impossible, and church is far beyond reach. So the Sabbath comes to the cabin in quiet form. Sweep the hearth clean, so the day feels set apart. Gather the family, seating each near the fire. Read a chapter aloud, voices stumbling but sincere. Sing softly, one hymn repeated, until it becomes more hymn than song. Rest, not entirely from chores but from their urgency, because nothing says reverence quite like pausing halfway through worship to poke at a stubborn log. the whispered warnings. When the hymn ends, Martha leans closer, her whisper nearly lost under the crackle of the fire. She tells the children to never whistle after dark. It calls wandering spirits. She warns against sewing on Sundays, lest needles pierce good fortune. She advises hanging dried garlic near the window to keep the air honest. Her words mingle faith with caution, stories with rule. Tom grips his whistle tightly, glancing at Martha with wide eyes. He does not play it again until morning. The myth of perfect piety. Later writers sometimes praised frontier families for unbroken devotion, as though no doubt or mixture touched their worship. Yet diaries show the opposite. A man in Ohio wrote of reading the Bible one night, then turning immediately to tell a ghost tale to keep the children's ears open. Faith did not exclude superstition. It sat beside it, both accepted without fuss. The stories told, after prayers, the tales begin. Amos clears his throat, mutters that his voice is rusty, then tells of a traveler who lost his way in the snow, guided home by a lantern no one else could see. Martha interrupts with her whisper, insisting the lantern was a spirit, not a man. The children lean forward, eyes wide. Another story follows, a cow refusing to give milk until a broom was placed across the stall. Tom giggles, clutching his whistle, and Amos shrugs, saying he saw it himself, or nearly saw it, once upon a time. Step by step, the shape of a frontier tale. A story always follows its own rhythm. Begin with a memory. Once, when the snow was deeper than now, add a strange turn, an animal that spoke, a light that wandered, a dream that came true. Pause for listeners to murmur, to doubt, to laugh. Stretch the ending, never quite sharp so it drifts into silence. Let the fire fill the gap, as though it has always known the tale. Because nothing says tradition quite like retelling a story whose ending no one remembers exactly. A gentle dilemma. One evening, Amos insists he saw a light in the woods, flickering like a lantern. Should you believe his story, treating it as a warning, or dismiss it, trusting only in reason? The choice is quiet, private, never declared aloud. The mind holds both belief and disbelief, letting them sit together like logs on the same fire. Evening atmosphere. The room grows heavy with scent, wax from the guttering candle, damp wool steaming near the hearth, faint herbs smouldering in the corner. Shadows ripple across the beams, stretching as the fire lowers. The children lean against quilts, their heads nodding with each whispered tale. Tom's whistle rests in his hand, silent at last. The hymn fades, the stories drift, the whispers fold into the night. Outside, the snow presses harder against the walls, but inside, the voices weave warmth thicker than wool. You exhale, your breath slow, steady, and let yourself drift with the cadence of faith and superstition entwined. Winter work and chores, the morning of labor. The fire is barely embers when you rise. The air smells of smoke and cold ash, and your hands sting as you pull on stiff mittens. Winter work waits outside, and though the myth tells of restful months, the reality greets you with the weight of unending tasks. The snow glitters faintly, and the only sound is the groan of the cabin beams adjusting to the frost. You step out, boots sinking deep, and the world seems silent except for the faint creak of the bucket swinging from your hand. The myth of winter rest. Some imagine winter as a season of idleness, farmers sleeping late, families gathered by fires, chores forgotten until spring. Historians note otherwise. A diary from 1841 records, "We worked as ever, only the work was of another kind. Roofs needed patching before snow caved them in, tools demanded sharpening, animals still needed feeding, and firewood had to be replenished daily." Rest was never true rest. It was simply another rhythm of labor. Step by step splitting wood, the axe waits, blade nicked from yesterday's use. The work begins, steady and deliberate. Place a log upright on the block, its bark dark with frost. Raise the axe, the wooden handle rough against your gloves. Swing downward, the crack echoing across the frozen yard. Pry the halves apart, steam rising faintly from the split heartwood. Stack neatly, each thud of wood against wood a measured note. Because nothing says morning routine quite like realizing you must repeat this 50 more times before breakfast. Amos and the missing axe. Amos appears, shoulders hunched, eyes down. "Borrow your axe again?" he asks, sheepish. He has misplaced his own again. You hand it to him without scolding. His forgetfulness is as much a part of the season as the snow itself. Later you may find his axe leaning against your own shed wall, hidden in plain sight. The rhythm of borrowing and lending is another form of labor. Patience measured as carefully as firewood. The smell of leather and iron. Inside, the tools rest by the hearth for repair. The smell of warm leather mixes with sharp iron and faint oil. Martha whispers as she checks straps, her fingers pressing along seams, murmuring that work must be steady, never rushed. Tom hovers nearby, blowing a single high note on his whistle, until Martha hushes him. Even chores must be done to a rhythm, she says, and sound can disrupt the pattern. Step by step sharpening the axe. When the blade dulls, the sharpening begins. Set the stone on your lap, its surface gritty beneath your palm. Drip water across it, the sound soft and quick. Draw the axe edge slowly, one side then the other, steel rasping faintly. Wipe the blade with a rag, the smell of metal sharp in the air. Hold it to the light, the edge shining, ready again for wood, because nothing says winter music quite like the scrape of steel against stone in a silent room. The myth of easy fires. Later stories suggest fires sprang up with ease, sparks flying into roaring flames. The truth was more stubborn. Wet wood hissed, moss smoldered, and smoke filled rooms before flames took hold. Families coaxed fires like children, patient, persistent. A letter from 1833 notes, "We spent more time blowing on coals than warming our hands at them." A gentle dilemma. The woodpile shrinks faster than expected. Do you spend your strength chopping more now before the storm worsens, or conserve your energy, hoping tomorrow's sun will ease the work? Neither choice is wrong, neither entirely safe. You weigh it quietly, staring at the axe, resting against the block. The wood splits, the tools scrape, the smoke curls upward. Amos shuffles away with your axe. Martha whispers at her sewing. Tom presses his whistle against his lips in silence. The rhythm of chores hums steady, endless as snow, and you breathe into its cadence, slow and even. Illness and remedies. The first cough. The sound begins softly, just a cough at night, muffled beneath a quilt. But in winter silence, it echoes. The air in the cabin is dry from constant fire, yet damp near the windows where frost gathers. Each breath feels heavy. You notice Tom clutching his whistle but not playing, his cheeks pale, his nose red. The myth remembers settlers as hardy, untouched by ordinary sickness, enduring winter with iron health. The reality is quieter and more troubling. Colds came often, fevers followed, and without doctors nearby, remedies were improvised. Families endured, not without illness, but despite it. Step by step, the onion poultice. Martha moves with practiced calm, whispering instructions. As she prepares a remedy, peel an onion, its sharp scent filling the cabin. Slice it thin, the sound crisp beneath the knife. Warm the slices near the fire, steam rising faint. Wrap them in cloth, pressing them against the chest. Whisper that the heat will draw out sickness, though no one can explain how, because nothing says frontier medicine quite like smelling like a soup pot while trying to sleep. The myth of whiskey as cure-all. Amos stumbles in, carrying a jug. He mutters that whiskey is the best doctor, taken by sip for coughs, by swallow for fevers, and by gulp for spirits. He pours a small amount, urging you to drink. Martha whispers that whiskey soothes, but does not heal, though Amos insists his grandfather lived to 80 on nothing but pork and whiskey. The children giggle at his story, though the truth remains uncertain. The smell of herbs. The cabin soon fills with another scent. Sage leaves burned in the hearth, their smoke sharp and bitter. Martha whispers that it clears the air, driving away unseen illness. Bundles of dried herbs hang from rafters, shadows swaying in firelight. The fragrance mingles with smoke and damp wool, a reminder that health was often trusted to plants as much as to prayer. Historians note that remedies varied from family to family. Some swore by garlic broth, others by mustard plasters, still others by silence and rest. No cure was certain, yet all were attempted. Step by step brewing herbal tea. When coughs grow harsh, you prepare tea. Heat water slowly, the kettle rattling on the hook. Drop in dried mint leaves, their scent sharp and cooling. Let it steep, steam curling into the dim room. Pour into a tin cup, the rim warm against your lips. Sip slowly, though bitterness outweighs comfort. Because nothing says wellness quite like pretending bitter water tastes like hope. A gentle dilemma. The herbs run low. You hold a small pouch, enough for perhaps 2 more tea. Do you use it now, easing Tom's cough tonight, or save it for a fever that might come later? The choice is quiet, pressing not with urgency, but with weight. You decide as the fire crackles, the herb's scent lingering on your fingertip. The coughs soften for a while, the herbs steam, and Amos snores faintly by the fire, jug in hand. Martha whispers prayers into the smoke. Tom rests, whistle clutched but silent, his breath shallow but steady. You exhale slowly, the remedy's working, or perhaps only comforting, and drift into the hush of winter night. The thaw and renewer. The first drip. It begins quietly. A drip from the eaves, faint but steady. You hear it before you see it, water falling through melting snow.
The air smells different, less of smoke, more of damp earth rising from beneath the frost. The sound is small, but after months of silence, it feels momentous. The myth imagines spring bursting suddenly, fields green, animals frisking, tables full. The reality is slow. Snow recedes inch by inch. Mud replaces ice. Stores grow thinner, not fuller. Hunger deepens before relief arrives. Renewal comes, but cautiously, with patience demanded even as spirits yearn to run free. Step by step watching the ice break. The river locked for months. The ritual of watching it thaw is simple but compelling. Walk to the bank, boots sinking into slush. Notice the cracks forming, lines spreading across the ice. Listen as water murmurs beneath, muffled but present. Wait for the groan, the sharp crack as a sheet breaks. Watch it drift away, slow and steady, carrying winter downstream. Because nothing says hope quite like staring at chunks of ice and cheering when they finally float away. Amos at the fence. Amos greets you with his usual grin, leaning on a fence that leans even harder than he does. The boards have warped under snow, and he mutters that he meant to fix it before frost, only the hammer went missing. He pulls a bent nail from his pocket, as if it proves his intent. You help him lift the rails, each piece heavy with damp. Work begins again, not as burden, but as renewal. Chores reborn as preparation. The smell of mud and smoke. Spring smells different. The mud carries a deep, earthy odor, rich and wet. Smoke from the hearth lingers less, drifting upward into warmer air. Inside, wool still dries by the fire, but outside the ground softens, releasing scents hidden all winter. You inhale, the smell of thaw as vivid as the crackle of firewood months before. The myth of immediate plenty. Later tales often suggests that spring brought quick abundance, fresh greens, milk, and ease. Historians remind us of the hungry gap, when stores were lowest just as winter ended. Barrels of flour scraped empty, beans dwindled, meat long gone. A settler wrote in 1844, "We were nearer starvation in March than ever in January, for the land gave nothing yet." Relief would come, but only after more waiting. Step by step preparing the garden. When the ground softens enough, the work of planting begins. Clear the last of the snow, dragging it aside with branches. Turn the soil with a spade, mud clinging to the blade. Drop in seeds, corn, beans, squash, pressing each carefully. Mark the rows with stakes, uneven but sufficient. Whisper hope into the soil, for patience is as much a tool as the spade. Because nothing says optimism quite like burying seeds while frost still lingers on the fence. A gentle dilemma. You hold the last of the beans in your hand. Do you cook them now, easing hunger tonight, or plant them, gambling on the future? Both choices matter, both carry risk. The decision weighs heavier than the beans themselves, small as they are. Evening light. The sun lingers longer, golden against the thawing snow. Shadows stretch differently, softer than in winter. The cabin smells of damp earth carried in on boots, mingling with the faint sweetness of the first wild onion, pulled from the ground. Tom runs outside, whistle shrill against the open air, his laughter louder now that snow no longer muffles it. Martha whispers that spring must be welcomed gently, lest it slip away again. The ice cracks, the earth softens, the days Amos fumbles with bent nails, Martha murmurs her blessings. Tom races with his whistle in the mud. The fire still glows, but the air promises more. You breathe slowly, filling your lungs with the scent of thaw, and drift with the quiet rhythm of renewal. The hungry gap. The snow thins, the air warms, but the pantry is nearly bare. You lift the lid of a barrel, only a scattering of beans at the bottom. A jar of pickles holds cloudy brine with one last pale wedge. Bread is stretched thin with more water than flour, loaves flat and heavy. The myth says spring was a relief, that hunger ended with the first green shoots. The truth is more patient and more difficult. The hungry gap pressed hardest when hope was stronger. A diary from 1846 reads, "March brought thaw and with it hunger, for nothing yet grew, and what we stored was gone." Step by step stretching the last supplies. Martha whispers as she works at the hearth, teaching the children how to make little into enough. Take the final handful of beans, soak them overnight, add water, onions if any remain, and stir into a thin broth. Break crumbs of hard bread into the pot, letting them swell. Stir slowly, whispering patience into the spoon. Serve with quiet gratitude, though stomachs are not full, because nothing says abundance quite like pretending your watery bean broth is stew. Amos is early planting. Amos, impatient as ever, plants seeds before the frost fully lifts. He grins, insisting he will harvest before anyone else. Martha whispers caution, The soil is still too hard, but Amos waves her off. A week later you see him frown at the blackened sprouts, killed by cold. He shrugs, muttering, "Well worth the try." His forgetfulness extends even to patience. The smell of thawing earth. You walk outside and the smell is strong mud, wet leaves, thawed manure near the barn. The air carries a heaviness, rich and pungent, unlike the crisp frost of winter. Your boots sink into soft ground, squelching with each step. The sound is sticky, pulling at your soles. The children laugh, splashing in puddles, coats muddied beyond recognition. Tom blows his whistle in triumph, the sharp note cutting above the core of returning crows. The myth of sudden warmth. Paintings often show spring arriving like a festival, flowers bursting, skies clear, fields green. The reality is uneven. Snow lingers in shadows, ice clings to fence posts, mornings still bite with frost. Families rose each day not certain if they faced winter or spring. One record from 1839 notes, "We planted one morning, and that night snow covered the rows." Spring was not a switch, but a negotiation. Step by step, repairing the cabin. With thaw comes labor. The cabin strained by snow needs mending. Patch the roof where shingles warped under ice. Repack moss between logs, where cold winds carved paths. Lift fallen fence rails, heavy with damp. Rehang the door swollen with moisture, until it fits its frame. Step back, listening to the cabin sigh, as though relieved of its own burden. Because nothing says spring cleaning quite like discovering the walls have been breathing cold air all winter. A gentle dilemma. The last of the pork lies salted in the barrel. You could eat it now, celebrating the thaw, or save it until crops rise, holding a thread of safety. The choice is quiet, debated silently at the hearth. Hunger pulls both ways. Evening gathering. Neighbors arrive, boots muddy, coats damp. Amos forgets his hat again. Martha carries herbs she saved all winter, and children cluster in the corner, their laughter freer now. Stories shift from ghosts and sickness to planting and The room smells of wet wool and hope, faint but real. The ice drips, the mud thickens, the stores shrink, and yet the light lingers longer each evening. Amos mutters at his failed sprouts. Martha whispers blessings for the soil. Tom runs with his whistle hum. The thaw unfolds slowly, unevenly, but surely. You breathe deep, the scent of earth filling your lungs, and drift into the promise of renewal.